Okay, I think we're ready to rock and roll, at least the first act. I want to welcome everyone this evening. There's a great deal of power that's represented in the intention and in the fulfillment that is embodied in the group that we've put together tonight around this not often discussed but always present issue of race in architecture as a microcosm of race in America.
We're going to have to do some things. We're going to have to act in some different ways, make ourselves a little uncomfortable, and probably make some other people a little uncomfortable. But I encourage you in the next couple of hours, imagine as you listen to these speakers first, and then as you think and ask questions and we discuss these things, what you have to do to make it unnecessary to have this same conversation 10 years from now.
Basically, the facts of the matter were that we're graduating as many African Americans now as we did in 1960.
I'm actually a chair of a student group here called SOCA, which used to be Students of Color Association. And 2 years ago, we changed that to Social Change and Activism because there were no students of color here, and so it didn't make any sense.
I guess I've been to these about every 10 years, oftentimes discussing similar issues. So it's not enough to just sit here and complain about the fact that there aren't more minorities on the faculty and so forth. They're hard to come by.
When I do the theory course, the first day, I say, okay, give me, from your perspective, from the student's perspective, the issues that you think are the theoretical issues of today. Okay, sustainability, we got to be green, we got ecology, we have to respect materials and so forth like that. And then that's usually the end of it. And, because usually there's not an African American in the class. And so I say, race?
Not an issue.
It's like, what? What are you talking about?
It's pretty difficult to structure a conversation in a classroom about topics of race if in fact there aren't African Americans in the room. And somehow the curricula that I went through and the curricula that I now teach are usually pretty impoverished when it comes to providing students with tools that give them a handhold about how to look at the built environment and to see something that may not directly reflect themselves.
And I actually just want to compare, though, architecture schools and with other disciplines in the university, because I'm also affiliated with the American Civilization program here, and most of the people there are historians. And it seems that there's an enormous difference between what we teach here and what is taught there, and in AmCiv and history. Issues of race, gender, ethnicity are always on the table. They're treated in increasingly sophisticated ways, and I think there would be enormous shock in a way in other departments in the university if they actually realize that these issues aren't even mentioned in this school.
I think that the history and theory is really a serious part of it, because I think that the things that made me want to leave this school were not like working all the time or being in studio, but were being in history classes where I was told that, and actually a professor said this, that there was no history in Africa in the 19th century except for when Africa was mentioned in Paris. And that's the kind of thing where no one batted an eye, and I almost lost, that's a real problem. And so then again, you can write a paper talking about Liberian former slaves from America going to Liberia, and taking cross-cultural architectures, and then they're like, oh wow, but the problem is the professors don't know anything about that, so they couldn't even speak to it.
If I start talking about these things, am I all of a sudden going to be known as that girl who talks about race all the time? Or, oh, that's all fine and good that you're planning this conference at Yale, but, let's get back in the studio, let's really focus on what's important here. And this is all just kind of this side topic that is really not enmeshed in what we're doing here.
I heard comments, for instance, that talked about the problems of diverse populations, but I didn't hear anything about what they would bring to architecture. And my sense is that if you want to attract people to an institution, they have to feel like they're welcome in that institution and they have something of value to bring.
Because diversity is so widely used these days, it's on everybody's lips, everybody has to do it, firms, everything. I wonder if it's lost some of its meaning, and if we don't need to unpack it a bit and talk about what it is, because what we are really talking about here is inclusion and exclusion.
Frankly, we need to put economics on the table because and I don't want to paint an entire brush, but there are lots of people of modest income in the African American community, and sometimes these are the first kids to go to college, and their parents are driving a bus or something else. They're not making a whole bunch of money. So when they say, you're going to spend this amount of money and this amount of time, and you're going to get $30,000 when you get out of here, and your sister is in med school, and when she gets out, she's going to get $300,000, I think you need to go to med school. So there is an issue there because, and that goes across the field, but some people can afford to take that hit more than others.
For 5 years prior to me getting into Penn, there were no African American students in the architecture program. The year that I got into there were 3 African American students that got in, and the reason, not the reason, but they had funding for us to go. So, I mean, just providing that funding, that commitment for the school to say this is something that we're invested in and we want a diverse student body and we're going to provide fellowships for people to attend the school made a difference between 0 graduates, which next year we'll graduate 3, the year after that we'll graduate 2, you know, so.
1 a year is a pretty embarrassing number. If the goal was to do something in terms of immediately increasing diversity, we could go to the community colleges or Franklin Institute in this part of the world that have programs that are feeder programs, as has occurred, for example, in San Francisco, where there's a commitment to recruiting outside of traditional circles for recruitment. We would find more diverse groups of individuals who've already demonstrated an interest in entering the design fields. But I don't see us doing any of that.
Is a year ago, I raised this point that why don't we fund scholarships to go to career discovery? Because about 30% of MArcs at the school come from that program. Everyone knows about it, and yet no one has taken any action, and I literally just don't have time anymore to do it. And it's absurd for a student to be the person who has to go between everyone at the
We
school.
used to have a
do
person
such a
here
freaking
who,
I mean, you could imagine the GSD running a design camp in the building at some part in the summer and really recruiting widely to get a lot of different kids to come. I think that there need to be very specific faculty goals to recruit African American faculty, which is, I mean, there's some feelers out there, but they're not, nobody is pushing, and I'm kind of aghast at this, to tell the truth.
And if in fact we wanted more diverse faculty, we would acknowledge that there are many people who can teach in design schools who don't hold MArcs, but who do hold advanced degrees in other fields where they can teach. Lawyers can teach zoning, and financial and business people can come in and teach business practices, and people who are planners can come in and teach planning. And in fact, not everyone who teaches here has to have an MArc in order to teach on this august faculty, and we could say to ourselves, we're going to recruit people from a broader range of areas so that they would serve as role models within this kind of environment, and we'd go and we'd do that.
The issue of institutional change is not to be taken lightly. There are a lot of risks, and they're easy to see, and there are a lot of benefits, and they're harder to see. I think it's really important to remember that the fiber of this country and of our institutions is so well imbued with racism that nobody has to do anything on an individual level to maintain it. And so it's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get rid of and to address.
There's always something that you can bring to whatever place that you represent, and I think that I would challenge each of you to come up with just one simple idea of how to connect to the communities that you're able to reach. And there are almost 30 people in this room. If you were just to do one thing, that's 30 more people that you're exposing to architecture, and maybe 10 of them will decide to to follow through. So
We tell much about ourselves as a society by what we leave behind in the built environment. Our ethnic diversity needs to be reflected and have its expression reflective of the values of that cultural reservoir, such that 50 or 100 years from now, as future generations look back at what we left to get an idea of who we were as a society, that there is a somewhat accurate picture. That you may not look at a building and be able to say, well, I know an Asian architect designed that, or I know a black architect designed that because it's got some aesthetic expression. This is simply in our toolkit as designers, where we communicate through an abstract language, that we refer very direct cultural references. So that kind of is my, soliloquy about why do I fight so hard for representation and opportunities and advocate on behalf of architects of color.